Hey, what's going on, guys? This Saturday night is Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou in a boxing match, and I know all the narratives going to this fight. Francis Ngannou is going to get KO'd. Francis Ngannou is going to get dominated. Francis Ngannou is going to lose. I'm here to tell you, no matter what happens on Saturday night, Francis Ngannou will come out a winner. And I wanted to make a video encompassing the entire Francis Ngannou situation because over the past 2 years, Dana White and UFC have put out a lot of false narratives, and you have UFC shills and Dana White sycophants regurgitating those same narratives over and over and over again. And when they're proven wrong, they then move the goalposts. And I think the goalposts are going to be moved again on Saturday, and I think some more false narratives are going to be born out of the Francis Ngannou Tyson Fury boxing match, and I want to discuss that as well. And I'm going to get into my actual prediction for this boxing match. But to tell this entire story, you have to go back to early 2020. Francis Ngannou decides he wants to fight out his UFC contract because he decided, you know what? I want to become a free agent and see what kind of negotiating power I have. The UFC does not like this. The UFC hates when any fighter tries to fight out their contract because if they become a free agent, then they have more leverage to negotiate a bigger deal with the UFC. And the UFC really absolutely hates this. So Francis Ngannou decides, I'm going to fight out my contract. The UFC is still trying to negotiate a new contract with him. He has 2 fights left on his deal, and he gets a title fight with Stipe Miocic. This is while Francis Ngannou and UFC are still on good terms. But UFC knows Ngannou's trying to fight out his deal, but they think, okay, we're going to be able to work out a new deal before he's ever on his last fight of his contract. He fights Stipe Miocic for the UFC heavyweight title at UFC 260 in March of 2021. He folds Stipe Miocic like a lawn chair, and he wins the heavyweight title. Well, the UFC tries to negotiate a new deal after that. Francis Ngannou, UFC can't come to terms. That's when the UFC really starts to get petty. UFC really starts to take shots at Francis Ngannou. The UFC then starts to be vindictive. They want Francis Ngannou to fight in August. He just fought at the end of March. Francis Ngannou said, give me till September. I'll be good in early September. The UFC says, no, you know what? We're going to have an interim heavyweight title fight instead. So you're going to have to wait until next year. We're going to put you on ice for a little while. You can fight the winner of that interim title fight because we need a heavyweight title fight in August instead of September. They crown an interim champion, which is Ciryl Gane. He beats Derek Lewis. And they decide, okay, we're going to do Francis Ngannou versus Ciryl Gane at UFC 270 in early 2022. Now, in this fight, this is Francis Ngannou's last fight on his deal, which the UFC already absolutely hates. I did a video before this fight even happened saying UFC and Dana White are praying that Francis Ngannou loses. And believe me, they were. They were praying that he loses. He went out there, he beats Ciryl Gane. And Dana White was absolutely heated. He was absolutely livid. He left the arena instead of wrapping the belt around Francis Ngannou's waist. That's how pissed he was. He was praying that Ciryl Gane was going to win that fight. He left rather than wrap the belt around Francis Ngannou's waist. Now, after this, it's kind of a gray area because Francis Ngannou has fought out his deal, but because the UFC has these restrictive clauses in their contracts, Francis Ngannou technically isn't free until a year from that date. He effectively isn't free until January, whatever the date was, January of 2023. But also Francis Ngannou came into the fight with a torn ACL. He needed to have surgery. He was going to be out a while anyway. So essentially it was kind of like, oh, well, Francis Ngannou is going to wait it out and then he'll be a free agent the following year because he's already injured anyway, so it doesn't matter. He's not actually missing any time. Well, Francis Ngannou waits it out. The UFC is still trying to negotiate a deal. And then January of 2023, the UFC announced we've released Francis Ngannou, which is false narrative number 1. We let Francis Ngannou go. That is not true at all. And that is a narrative that's been just regurgitated time and time again. Like the UFC cut Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou fought out his contract. And then even though it's super restrictive because you're a champion, you won a championship fight, now you're automatically extended for 1 year or 3 fights from that time you fought last. Either 1 year or 3 fights. If you compete in 3 fights after that, you can get out of your contract without signing a new contract. Francis Ngannou just waited it out. Francis Ngannou fought out his contract. He left the UFC. The UFC did not cut him. The UFC did not release him. In January of 2023, at the last day, basically, Francis Ngannou is finally out of his contract. The UFC announces Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane. And that's when Dana White and the smear campaign begins because they're like, okay, we're going to book a new heavyweight title fight with Jon Jones and Ciryl Gane. Francis Ngannou's gone. We cut him. That's what Dana White kind of said, and a lot of fans were going along with that. And what he started saying is Francis Ngannou is scared of Jon Jones, and that's why he left. And we heard that so many times. Oh, I wouldn't want to fight. Does anybody in this room really think Francis can beat Jon Jones? Well, yeah, that's why we wanted to see the fight. This was one of the biggest fights in UFC history the UFC could have made, was Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. And Dana's acting like, oh, this fight wouldn't even been competitive. And what's crazy is when I first started this channel, I started about 2.5 years ago. I made a video at the time discussing this topic because Dana White was negotiating with Jon Jones at the time. Francis Ngannou at this point in time, I don't even think he was champion, or he just became champion, actually. He just became champion. Dana White was acting like Jon Jones was scared of Francis Ngannou at the time. I made a whole video about it. It's like the second, third, fourth, fifth video on my channel. You can go check it out. I'll put it in the playlist down in the description. But at this point in time, back then, he's acting like, oh, Jones is scared of Francis Ngannou because Jones is trying to negotiate a new contract. Now, fast forward a couple years later, all the UFC fans forget, and Dana White's like, yeah, Francis is terrified of Jones. That's why he didn't re-sign. That couldn't be further from the truth. The UFC wasn't willing to offer him a contract that he wanted with the benefits that he wanted. That is why he left the UFC, and he fought out his deal. And had the antitrust lawsuit not been going on, Francis Ngannou might not even got out of his deal because they added a sunset clause. When the UFC was facing this antitrust lawsuit, they added a sunset clause to make their contracts less restrictive, which essentially meant from the date you signed your contract, 5 years later, that contract expired. Now, they've since changed that and kind of edited it a little bit different to make it more restrictive, but that is why Francis Ngannou was able to even get out of his contract. That is the only reason why, is because of that sunset clause. So then you hear Dana White going on more of a smear campaign. You hear fans say this too. Francis Ngannou is inactive because Francis Ngannou fought once in 2022, once in 2021, and once in 2020. Now let's clear that up real quick, because even though on paper Francis being inactive is true, the only year that being inactive was his fault was 2022 when he had a torn ACL. Because you look back to 2021, Francis Ngannou was publicly asking for fights. You go back to 2020, before he was even champion, he was publicly asking for fights. It's all well documented. And Dana White's like, oh, we're going to get him a fight. We're going to get him a fight. He's literally begging for fights because he already decided he wanted to fight out his deal. And Dana White wasn't able to give him a fight. Wasn't able to give him a fight after he won the belt because they didn't want him fighting out his contract. They tried to delay that Cyril Gane fight for so long because they did not want him fighting out his contract. So the whole narrative of inactivity is just completely false from the fans, from Dana White. Technically, it's true, but really only in 2022 was it Francis Ngannou's fault, and that's because he had a torn ACL. So, I mean, that argument's completely dead right there. Then, while he's a free agent, and you have Dana White smearing him, you have a lot of fans smearing him, and you have now one championship with Chatri, I don't remember how to pronounce his last name, and you have BKFC come out and say, essentially, Francis Ngannou wants too much money. We're not paying him. He's asking for too much. We've offered him this. We've offered him that. Well, what's weird is both of those promoters who came out and said that said it the very week they were having one of their biggest events. They used Francis Ngannou to promote themselves. That's all they did. That's all they did. Because BKFC couldn't afford me. They couldn't afford Roy Nelson from the Kentucky State Fair, okay? They are not ever going to be able to afford Francis Ngannou. That was never an option. They're probably going to be out of business in a couple years. Maybe I'll be wrong. But they could never afford Francis Ngannou. BKFC was never in the Francis Ngannou sweepstakes. Now you have one championship who Chatri is basically a snake oil salesman. He's like, oh, Francis wanted all these different things, and he wanted this, and he wanted that, and there's no way, he wants too much money, and blah, blah, blah. We offered him $20 million. That's what you had Chatri come out and say. Again, the same week he's having one of the biggest promotional events for himself, using it to promote himself. Well, it came out afterwards, Francis Ngannou had already signed a deal with PFL. Out of respect for Chatri, since Francis hadn't technically signed the deal, but he had already kind of agreed to it, this was the deal he wanted, he took it to Chatri and said, look, this is the current deal I'm probably going with. What can you offer me? And he said, I can't offer you this. So Chatri was already out of the sweepstakes because PFL had already gave him a great deal. So then Francis Ngannou signs with PFL. And I talked about this ad nauseum before Francis Ngannou signed a contract. Keep in mind, people were making all these narratives up. And it had only been a couple months since Francis Ngannou was officially out of the UFC, and he was still recovering from his injury. There wasn't talk of him really being healthy until like March or April of this year. So he got out of his contract in January, and like over the next 2 to 3 months, you have people just going crazy. Well, he finally signs with PFL, and before the PFL signing, I told people, I said, look, Francis Ngannou will sign a new contract. He will make a lot of money. He'll get a lot of things that he wants. He'll sign a fine contract. I don't know the exact details of what that contract will be yet. We'll talk about it when it happens. But I guarantee the day a promoter signs Francis Ngannou, it will go from Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag, Francis Ngannou made a mistake, to now that promotion made a mistake. And Francis Ngannou signed a deal with PFL, the biggest deal in MMA heavyweight history. That is the biggest deal in MMA heavyweight history. He got, basically $10 million a fight. He got all these different things. He got equity in PFL. He got PFL Africa. He got people on the board of basically to advocate for fighters. And he got his opponent guaranteed $1 or $2 million purse when they fight Francis Ngannou. He essentially got everything he wanted, and he got the ability to box as well. He was free to box if he so pleased and he could find the right boxing match. Well, immediately after this contract was announced, Francis Ngannou's irrelevant. PFL is going to go out of business. What was PFL thinking? This was the fans' narratives. This was kind of Dana's narrative a little bit, but people were saying these types of things. Oh, Francis, he's not going to sell any pay-per-views over in PFL. And then one of the major talking points after Francis signed with PFL, people were saying, oh, he didn't get that boxing match. He wanted that boxing match so bad. He's never going to get that boxing match. It's never going to happen. That's what he really wanted, and he's never going to get it. That was one of the major talking points. Now, I've kind of debunked a lot of these things in previous videos. There's one which I'll link specifically down in the description where I go over all the details of his contract. But there's one that people talk about, and they say pay-per-view points, pay-per-view points, pay-per-view points. Now, had Francis Ngannou fought Jon Jones, he would have gotten pay-per-view points. Now, based on older public information, based on what the UFC was paying pay-per-view points to, I believe it was Brock Lesnar, Francis Ngannou would have made something like $1.5 million off of pay-per-view points based on, I can't remember what I did the math off of, but over 1 million buys against Jon Jones. Now, in the PFL, they're not going to sell the same amount of pay-per-views. Depending on the opponent, they're not even going to get close to 1 million. But Francis Ngannou is getting a 50% cut of the profit. Plus, Francis Ngannou has all these other benefits from PFL. Plus, on top of that, Francis Ngannou is free to get sponsorship, which is definitely going to be a couple million right there. So no matter what, almost no matter any way you slice it, Francis Ngannou is making more money in the PFL than he would have ever dreamed of in the UFC. But he also got a bunch of things that he really wanted, and one being the freedom to box. Francis Ngannou always said it was his dream to be able to go out there and box against somebody, and PFL gave him that freedom. Dana White wasn't willing to give him that freedom, and Dana White saying, we don't make freak show fights. That's a freak show fight. That's a gimmick fight. That's just not what we do here. And the irony is just insanity, because when he said this was the same weekend he announced the BMF title fight. That was the same weekend he announced that. Now, when Francis Ngannou began to have negotiations to box Tyson Fury, we didn't really know about it publicly, but the way Dana White was acting, I knew what was going on behind the scenes, because all of a sudden, even though Dana had just said, oh, we don't make gimmick fights, and the MMA media doesn't ask any questions, they're too scared of him, they don't do their jobs, they're glorified publicists, he goes, yeah, Jon Jones, Tyson Fury would be a lot of fun. And he begins trying to make Jon Jones versus Tyson Fury, because in his mind, he's getting information from some type of sources saying Francis Ngannou's negotiating a deal to box Tyson Fury. And Dana White is so petty, and he's so pissed that Francis Ngannou left his organization, that he's trying to undercut him. He tried to do that. Well, lo and behold, Francis Ngannou, the Jon Jones Tyson Fury fight was almost never going to happen. But you hear an announcement finally, Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou. It's happening this Saturday now, but that got announced a couple months ago. And of course, we never really got a real reaction from Dana White. The media really kind of danced around. It didn't really ask specific questions or press on it at all. Dana White disappeared from the media for like a month after it was announced, until it kind of cooled off a bit as well. But he gets this fight, he gets this boxing match, and he is going to make more in this boxing match than he made in his entire UFC career combined. He's going to make over $10 million boxing Tyson Fury. More than he made, again, I'm going to state this again, in his entire UFC career combined. Every single dollar he made in the UFC, you put it in one bank account, he's going to make more in one night against Tyson Fury. And, I've heard people say, some of the other narratives I've heard, well, what about his legacy? He could have had better legacy in the UFC. Legacy doesn't pay the bills, first off. Legacy doesn't give you long-term wealth at all, okay? It doesn't give you that. If Francis Ngannou had fought Jon Jones, he would have made a lot of money, okay? but it was no guarantees after the fact. Francis Ngannou wanted these other things. Plus, now he's got guarantees of equity in the PFL. He's got guaranteed of PFL Africa. He's got all these future endeavors, and he hasn't even made it there yet. He's not going to fight in PFL till 2024. He's boxing Tyson Fury. And I've also heard a lot of people say, well, Francis Ngannou's irrelevant. And while this is going on, and so many people were saying this time and time again, more people are talking about Francis Ngannou than ever. That is, I mean, I could not believe so many people are saying Francis Ngannou left the UFC is going to be irrelevant. More people have talked about him literally in 2023 than I believe any other year. And that's insanity because he hasn't even fought yet. He's going to have his first fight I think it's October 28th against Tyson Fury. It's going to be a boxing match. Now, it's crazy to me that there's so many narratives that's just put out by Dana White. The MMA media just regurgitates them. The fans just regurgitate them. And what it really comes down to is the fans are mad that they never got Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. And I'm with you. That is the number one fight I've wanted for the last 2 years. But the point remains, Francis Ngannou was never scared of Jon Jones, okay? If you believe that, you're delusional. He begged for the Jon Jones fight before he was even champion. When he became champion, he was begging for the Jon Jones fight. But guess what? Dana and Jon Jones were having an issue negotiating a new contract for Jon Jones. That's why it never happened. Meanwhile, Dana's acting like, oh, Jon Jones is scared of Francis Ngannou. He's moving to middleweight because he's scared of Francis Ngannou after what he did to Stipe Miocic. That was the narrative. And if you truly believe that, there's really no discussing it with you. There's no discussing with you. I'm upset as well. I wanted Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. But ultimately, Francis Ngannou, he was the real winner here because he got everything he wanted. And the real loser here, I don't even want to say the UFC is a real loser because at the end of the day, they'll be just fine. The real loser is us fans because Dana White and UFC should have been able to find a way to make this happen. And Francis Ngannou was even willing to sign a 1 or 2 fight deal just to fight Jon Jones. He was willing to take the contract that they were offering him and have it for 1 or 2 fight deal. And he was going to fight Jon Jones. I almost said box Jon Jones there. He was going to fight Jon Jones, but he was going to be out of his contract. He didn't want to be signed for 6 or 8 fights because the UFC likes to sign prominent fighters for long contracts. And you would think, oh, that's great for the fighter. No, it's not because the UFC can cut you at any point in time. None of that money's guaranteed. But at the same time, now you are locked in this contract that has so many restrictive clauses. If you fight out your contract and you're the champion, you're automatically extended for 1 year or 3 months. After that, they have an exclusive negotiating period where you can't talk to anyone else after that period extends. You can't talk to anyone before that period ends. But then after that, they have an exclusive matching clause where essentially now you can go out and look for other deals. But the second you get a new deal, you have to bring it back to the UFC. And the UFC gets to say, okay, well, we'll match it and you'll stay here now. Which, okay, that's okay. I mean, that's whatever. But at the same time, it's just super restrictive. It's almost impossible to get out of these contracts. And Francis Ngannou did the impossible. And he set the precedent for other fighters. And I'm telling you right now, he's getting other fighters paid. I think he got Derek Lewis paid. Derek Lewis fought out his contract. The UFC tried to put him on the prelims. Then, because of an injury, he got bumped to the main card. Then afterwards, he immediately re-signed with the UFC. I guarantee they gave him a massive contract because the last thing they wanted was Derek Lewis leaving the UFC and going to make $2 million fighting Francis Ngannou in PFL. Now, as far as the boxing match between Tyson Fury and Francis Ngannou, I'm not really interested in MMA fighters versus boxers. But the way the UFC and the way the UFC fans have treated Francis Ngannou over the past year and a half, I'm going to buy the pay-per-view. I think it's like $80. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to stream it. I want to support Francis Ngannou. Now, in terms of what's actually going to happen, I've always believed MMA and boxing are 2 different sports. People want to have this debate like they're the same sport. I think boxers get killed in MMA. It's not even up for debate. I think MMA fighters get killed in boxing. Now, Francis Ngannou does have ungodly power, so there's always a puncher's chance, but I doubt it. I think he's going to lose to Tyson Fury. I think he's going to lose to him. I think he probably gets finished. He probably gasses out and gets finished. I don't know what round it'll be, but I think he's going to lose, and I think he's going to get finished by Tyson Fury. But at the end of the day, I don't think it hurts his stock that much. Of course, it's going to be a little bit of hit, but people are going to act like, oh, this is the end of Francis. Nobody cares about Francis anymore. Francis, oh, he's a bum now. He got beat up by one of the best heavyweight boxers of all time. That's going to be the new narrative they come up with. Oh, Francis is done. Tyson took his chin. He's irrelevant now. He's heading off to PFL. I don't care what you say. People will care when Francis Ngannou fights in PFL. When he's knocking dudes dead in PFL, in MMA, people will watch. And he's playing with house money at that point. He's already got 10 million plus if he gets pay-per-view points in that as well. He's already got 10 million plus from boxing Tyson Fury. Now he's fighting on the biggest contract he's ever gotten for PFL, and he has all these other things going on within PFL with equity. It doesn't matter if he goes out there and he's knocking out guys that you don't even care about. People will tune in and watch Francis Ngannou fight in PFL. And at that point, it doesn't matter even how much money he's making because he's already made so much money from having the ability to box Tyson Fury. And imagine he goes out there and knocks out Tyson Fury. I mean, imagine what the chaos that would ensue if he knocks out Tyson Fury, because I think Tyson Fury already has a boxing match lined up for December. I think something along those lines, or late November, something along those lines. He already has another boxing match lined up soon after Francis Ngannou, because that's how serious he's taken Francis Ngannou. Imagine if Francis Ngannou goes out there and shocks the world. That would be the craziest story in combat sports history. The fact that Francis went through all these different things with the UFC, all these dumb narratives, and then boom, he gets this boxing match, makes more money than he makes in his entire UFC career, and then knocks him out. Now, I don't think that's super likely. Again, I think Tyson Fury wins the fight. I will be streaming that fight because I'm going to buy it. I'm going to support it. I might as well stream it. So join me on Saturday watching it. But I'm just so tired of all these false narratives that have been portrayed by fans and Dana White, really the driving force behind them. Francis Ngannou took on the UFC and he won, and he got everything he could have ever asked for. He's getting closer to 40. He signed this massive deal to fight Tyson Fury. He signed this massive deal with PFL. He will be just fine. He set himself up for the rest of his life, and he trailblazed a path for other fighters to do the same. And I don't care. We may not be able to pick him out specifically, but I'm telling you right now, Francis Ngannou long-term has gotten fighters paid more, whether you want to believe that or not. And I'm telling you, it already happened with Derek Lewis, and it probably already happened with other heavyweights because they're thinking, well, I can go to PFL and make $1 or $2 million fighting Francis Ngannou. But you guys, let me know what you think about this entire topic down in the comments. Let me know who you think is going to win the boxing match. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.